This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Dragon Mind. I have with me today Ian from Incendium RPGs. Ian, how are you doing today?
I'm doing most excellent, John. It's great to be back on the show.
Yeah, no, life has been pretty busy over the summer. Dragon Mind listeners will know that the episodes have been a little bit more sporadic. And I like to think it's because we've been saving our coverage energy for the big release of D&D 2024. So today we're going to be talking about our thoughts and opinions on the new D&D 2024 Player's Handbook. We'll take a look at the Dungeon Master's Guide and Monster Manual when they come out, and decide from there if they're worth their own coverage. Although that being said, having listened to Ted from Nerd Immersion cover a preview of what's in the Dungeon Master's Guide, I am pretty confident that both of those products are going to be well worth our attention.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really looking forward to checking out that guide. Honestly, when I got the PHB for 2024, I was like, this is probably going to be the last D&D 5e book that I buy. Mostly because when I run my games, I'm not really going back into books and looking into like the rules and stuff like that. I kind of had a firm understanding of them. And with the new rules updates in the glossary and all that stuff, and new spell changes and things, I figured that this would be pretty much all I need. But, you know, if I have the money, I am looking into getting the DMG and the Monster Manual as well. But it's not something I feel as like pressing in terms of like expanding my collection of Dungeons and Dragons books.
So just to kick things off, what are your initial thoughts and impressions of the new PHB?
So it's really interesting to see all of the artwork. I think most people point out how much more art there is in the PHB this time around, or at least it seems it's more upfront and in your face. And I really like that because there's like, you know, really inspirational pieces of like, you know, what characters could look like. On the other hand, I do also think that there's a lot more organization in the book. I think we've mentioned that previously, that the way it's set up is a lot more new player friendly, where you can go and build your character in the order that would make sense to build it rather than trying to flip back and forth. Generally speaking, I think it's way better organized. I do like the rules glossary and how it explains to you certain terms is really nice. I think that it's kind of cool to see that in like the spells list. Previously, you had a spell list for your characters, but now they also not only show you what the spells are, but they have this like special column that like gives you like extra information that might be pertinent to preparing your character.
When I first opened up the book, the first thing that jumped out to me was just how well organized it was and how much the visual organization makes a difference to how easy it is to understand a lot of the material. Listening to Todd Kenrick, Chris Perkins, and James Wyatt talk about the new Dungeon Master's Guide, it was kind of funny because Todd Kenrick would be like, "Oh, so there are magic item prices now," and Chris Perkins like, well, there were always magic item prices. It's just people didn't see them because it felt kind of hidden away in a lot of similar ways to how in 2014 customizing your background has always been an option, but just from the visual organization, it kind of feels hidden and not everybody would notice it even on like the 20th or 30th read through of the book. It really jumped out to me, especially talking about the artwork, how clean the book looks. Going into the classes and subclasses, like every subclass has a column of just a full body portrait of what the subclass looks like, with the next column over being all of the features. So it's just really clean to see how everything links together. And I think it just makes it easier for new players to also just understand what each subclass's particular playstyle is. because rather than jumping from one side of a page to another, or even flipping from one page over to the back side of the same page, it can be just a little harder to mentally link how the features build on each other. Whereas when it's just one big column, it's a lot easier to see just how your character is going to build over time. So, getting into chapter 1, which is how to play the game, I know you had some thoughts on this first section covering the general rules.
I feel like all the rules that are explained in chapter 1 are very familiar. They're much more clearly defined. There's less wiggle room in terms of like exploits that you might see. And it's definitely nice to have direct in-game examples of how each of the pillars of play are done. For example, they show like text of like, here's an example of how it would go when the characters are entering combat in Castle Ravenloft. It was really cool because it's like literally exactly how the combat tends to run, like in dialogue with each other at the table, not just an example of like flavor text or box text, or a write-up of how the campaign was going. I think it's very natural. Like there's very human reactions of like the laughing at like oh man, all right, I crit failed on that one. And I think that'll really help the new players as well. It definitely is nice to see how, and I would show it to the camera, but it's going to take up the whole screen. But they have like numbers that correspond to specific things that are happening in combat that relate to the rules that they just explained before they showed the example.
Yeah, no, the examples of play were really well written. Having skimmed through a lot of different RPG products, uh, a lot of them will have like it's almost written like a play. These examples of play. The difference is that this is the first time I've seen it, and another game could have done it first, where the example of play is embedded within the rules section. Usually, like this is how it's kind of presented in the 4th edition products I have. It's usually like whole chunk of rules, and then at the end, an example of play. But there's not an explanation. It's just something that you read. Rather, breaking up the information with examples, like small bit of information, example, small bit of information, example, is another example of how digestible the new formatting makes all of the content.
And there was one thing that was just like a holdover from 2014 5th edition discussion that we had regarding hit points, so unrelated to the examples. I just noticed, on page 27, they define hit points and they say that it represents durability and the will to live, rather than like how much blood you have in your body, so to speak.
I think it's a great example of the reason that the rules are more digestible beyond just the formatting is I once had a writing teacher tell me you just want to cut the fat. So if it's not functional, you probably don't need it, especially if it's something like rules text as opposed to something more creative or poetic. So for example, I brought up the 2014 description, and in 2014 it says hit points represent a combination of physical and mental durability, the will to live, and luck. Whereas the 2024, it just says hit points represent durability and the will to live. So it's a much shorter, cleaner, concise description of the same thing. And that's like apparent throughout a lot of the text. Even though a lot of the rules haven't changed, they've been rewritten to be a little bit more concise and direct. And just as a reader, it makes it a lot easier to feel like I've got it down a lot quicker. Chapter 2 is character creation.
Character creation is definitely a lot more streamlined, as I was talking about earlier in the podcast. That it's really nice to have like a class overview for what the writers intended, the role of the classes and their complexity. I thought the new character sheet was really interesting. I still think I prefer the old spell slot paper, just because like in here it says you have to write down the level of the spell versus like where it was organized by level. I think that I'll have to try and play with this character sheet before I really get a good idea of if it's useful or not. Also, I kind of wish that they had a blank sheet in the player's handbook instead of the one with the numbers on it.
That was actually an interesting discussion point in the community. Was some people really missed having the blank character sheet in the book. Other people were like, well, you can just download it on D&D Beyond. What's the big difference? But I don't know. It's just interesting. So Michael, who I often do the Untitled TTRPG podcast with, is designing his own game Distal. And so we've had a lot of game design conversations outside of the podcast regarding everything that goes into designing a TTRPG. And something that the two of us have talked about a lot is how the function of a character sheet is largely teaching your players about your game by the way that it's asking you to organize information. So it's really interesting that you brought up the spell sheet, because on the one hand, I do agree that organizing the spells in chunks based off of level is a good way to go about it. Having built a few characters using the 2024 rules, again, not having played a lot of them, but having built a lot of them, one thing I do find that's interesting is just how easy it is to get like a lot of cantrips. So even off of my latest episode, reviewing the 2024 cleric for practical possibilities, someone was mentioning, you could multi-class in a druid, and that gives you 3 free druid cantrips. And I don't know about you, but in 2014, I'd often run out of space on that little cantrip thing. So if anything, by having it just be this one big list, it does make it so that there's not any wasted space, that you can organize your spells and just have maybe a few less first level spells, but a lot of second level spells. And just from like a teaching new players perspective, the other function of the bubbles is it does point out the fact that some spells require concentration and some spells are rituals. So for a new player learning the game, even just seeing that there's a column to fill in that bubble is asking them to engage with the game a little bit more. There's been plenty of times I've had players in 2014 just write down the spell name and not really understand the like material components that are part of that spell. Again, asking them to fill out each of these different little elements of a spell is just helping them learn it a little bit more. Because the thing about learning is learning happens through engagement, not through just talking about it and then hoping that the other person is listening.
One thing I noticed actually, there's no that all that personality stuff is just in one box now. You remember they had flaws and all that stuff. I kind of like that because that never really, at least not for our groups, I would say, never really came into play.
Something that's in this player's handbook that wasn't in 2014 is just a few tables using your ability scores to help develop your character. So for example, one of the tables has to do with strength. So it says if your character has a high strength, you may describe them as muscular, sinewy. I don't like that one. Protective, direct. But if they have a low strength, they might be weak, slight, self-conscious, indirect. So rather than using these highly specific, lengthy things, like one of the personality traits was like, I can't wait to walk into someone's bedroom and assassinate them, or something like it was like this weird, you can't draw a story out of how specific some of those personality traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws were. By having these just like traits that your character has based off of their ability score, it really helps new play and veteran players too. It helps anyone just think of their character's story through the mechanics so that you can achieve that ludo narrative harmony of the mechanics of the character I'm playing match the narrative I'm envisioning.
Moving away from the character sheet, that's interesting that you're coming into the alignments as well. Coming after that, D&D assumes that characters aren't of an evil alignment and that you should check with your DM before making an evil character. And I think that's really, really great because we've all heard the like horror stories of like, it's what my character would do. And they're doing all this like nonsense stuff just because it's like, well, I'm chaotic neutral or I'm neutral evil, right? One of the less bad bad guy traits of alignment.
Just to build off of that, one of the things in this book is kind of like this personality trait section. There are all these little soft reminders as opposed to rules reminders sprinkled throughout. So, like the "What would your character do?" reminded me that in the rules, there's a sidebar that's like, all right, what your character would do is an awesome way to honor the story of the character you're trying to tell, as long as it's adding to the fun at the table. Because we've both been in games where somebody does something completely counter to what the party is trying to accomplish. Everybody else is not having fun with that decision, but the other person's like, well, it's what my character would do. So yeah, of course. And so it's just a reminder that if you're using this is what my character would do as a justification for something that the players don't like, then it's missing the whole point of the game. So there's a time and place for it, kind of like there's a time and place for optimization, but there is a line between optimization and exploiting the rules. And you can optimize and not be exploitative of the rules. So it's just, again, one of those things that I think they're doing a good job with in these latest books.
So going on to chapter 3, I really like just the front and center, awesome piece of art, full page of art right there. I really like how they're describing the different classes in order here as you'll encounter them, and their subclasses. I think they're so cool, and it gives you an idea of like what they intended for each of these subclasses, because the class has a specific like thing that it's good at, but then the subclass gives you a specialty. Going on to all of course, they got the art on each side. We talked about how they present each feature is really nice. One thing I noticed with each class is that the first page of the class gives you your level 1 feature and tells you what it takes to become level 1 or multi-classing. And it gives you all your core traits and tells you what ability you should probably prioritize.
The whole core traits thing, they definitely stole this formatting from Pathfinder 2nd Edition. This is how Pathfinder 2nd Edition presents its classes. They said, here are some core traits, and then at first level, you get the core traits and something else. Something, now that we're into like more the mechanics of individual player options, I think was really smart is you see this with the feat design too, but Rage as an example, they have little headers for each of the different bullet points. So in 2014, a lot of these bullet points were the same, but they were just that. It was just a little bullet point and then the description of what it would do. So by putting a label to it, like for Rage, damage resistance, rage damage, strength advantage, by having the little title be a summary of what's being described, again, it just makes it easier to remember. Because that's one of the biggest things I find with D&D when we're talking about complexity and digestibility, is just the amount of time someone forgets something that they have. And yeah, you can be like, oh, they need to do their homework, they're responsible for organizing it. And does that make the game more fun? To me, the answer is the game is most fun when the players are able to make the most of the character they built. So by having all of these little headers, it really just helps a player learn and remember each of their features a little bit better.
John, what do you, I mean, you probably don't have like a favorite, but like what are some subclasses that you really like prefer, that kind of stood out to you?
So actually, I know it's really interesting how like a lot of the community will get excited by certain subclasses and then I'll be completely excited by a different one. So Barbarian's a good example of Wild Heart actually is really intriguing. I know a lot of people are excited about World Tree, but for Wild Heart, just for years watching Barbarian builds at my table, Bear Totem Warrior Barbarian was always the go-to one because the resistance to all damage except psychic was pretty powerful, especially when the combats end up as just exchanges of damage. So I actually really like that the Bear Wildheart doesn't have resistance to force, necrotic, radiant, and psychic. Like there are 4 types it's able to take full damage by, and that you get to choose a different animal option every time you rage. So in 2014, wolf and eagle were present, but nobody would ever take them because even though they were kind of interesting, they were nowhere near as powerful as the bear option. So let's say you're fighting a vampire that is dealing mostly necrotic damage, and you know that your bear wild heart isn't going to be resistant to it. Now you can switch to eagle or wolf to use these different ones so you can be a little more strategic with your barbarian. And just going up through this is like I always get really attracted to the customizable subclasses. So it's one of the reasons why I kind of like hunter rangers, because it's not just a feature you get, you are choosing from a menu of options in the feature. Battle Master Fighter I still love, even though it really hasn't changed for the new edition. Is there a particular subclass or subclasses that have drawn you?
I like some of the changes that they made to like Zealot and Berserker, that it appears that they removed there was some like exhaustion mechanics or something before, and it looks like they removed that, and I like that they removed that because now I actually want to try and play a Berserker.
Berserker is interesting because it used to be almost unplayable as a subclass because of the exhaustion mechanic, like you mentioned. Treant Monk recently has been posting videos on average DPR for 2024 and how it compares to his old baseline of warlocks casting Eldritch Blast with Hex. And he said Berserker is the subclass build that has had the highest DPR, which is actually really exciting to hear. If I have a new player that just wants to hit things really hard, being able to recommend Berserker is kind of nice, of just roll a bunch of extra dice when you hit for damage.
Yeah, exactly. Archfey Warlock was the first character I ever made in D&D. They got Step of the Fae. I just love teleporting and just like Misty Step and stuff like that. I really like how they have like Refreshing Step. You get some temp HP, Taunting Step. They have disadvantage on attack rolls against people other than you. One thing I wasn't sure here, and I was wondering if you could help me clarify this. It says level 3, Steps of the Fae. You can cast Misty Step without a spell slot equal to a number of times of your charisma modifier. And you can regain all of these uses on a long rest. But then in Misty Escape, it just says you can cast Misty Step as a reaction, as a response to taking damage. And then you get these Steps of the Fae options. So I'm wondering if the reaction Misty Step is unlimited or not when it comes to the charisma modifier and stuff, because it's a separate feature. So I feel like the Misty Step as a reaction almost feels unlimited. But then it says Steps of the Fae in the bottom. So I'm just wondering, like, is all that Steps of the Fae stuff, is that just like whenever you Misty Step as a whole? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I would treat those as two different bullet points because of the words in addition. So it would be that, when you cast Misty Step, you at 6th level, you get all 4 of those strategic options. You get Refreshing, Taunting, Disappearing, and Dreadful. And in addition, there's a lot of this kind of coding language in the rules where like you can cast Misty Step as a reaction. It means that when you take damage, you can change the casting time from 1 bonus action to 1 reaction. So when you Misty Step as a reaction, you are also casting the Misty Step spell, so you also get one of these 4 strategic options, which I do like how with the subclasses, a lot of times multiple classes will dip into the same specialization flavor. So, for example, Fey Wanderer is a type of ranger in this. Glamour is like the Fey flavored bard. And in general, when the same classes are stepping into the same flavor, there's at least some unified mechanic underlying that flavor. So when it comes to Fey options, usually some kind of teleportation and like charm effect is like, and psychic damage is like usually built in. So it's just nice to see that kind of thematic unity amongst the mechanics, as opposed to 2014 where it felt kind of all over the place, where you had one Fey option that acted completely differently than another Fey option.
Yeah, absolutely. But does it take away from your uses of Steps of the Fae? That's what I'm wondering as well, though. Right?
Yeah, you can cast it with the Steps of the Fae feature, which is the charisma mod, or you can use spell slots. It doesn't matter which one, but it's not unlimited.
Whenever you cast that spell. Okay, there's the key words there. And then, of course, Wild Magic Sorcerer. I'm really happy with the changes they made to Wild Magic Sorcery. It's not a Mother May I feature anymore. You used to have to ask your DM if you could use this core feature of Wild Magic of just like rolling on the Wild Magic table. Most of the effects, as Treant Monk said, he read all these for me. Thanks, Treant Monk. Most of the effects are very positive, neutral, and then there's like a handful that aren't great, like the potted plant one. But of course, it's Wild Magic, so you get what you ask for. I like the class changes. I don't think there's anything bad with the class changes, even when there was things that were nerfed. I think it's a little bit more well-rounded, and there's not really like quote unquote S tier classes and subclasses, which is one of the things that Treant Monk has as a hallmark of good game design, of not having like the class that you should choose and is the best class every time.
Yeah, there's definitely most likely a strongest class and weakest class, which, it remains to be seen. The official game needs probably about a year or two of getting in optimizer's hands to really determine consistently what like the quote unquote best classes, and the gap between most powerful and least powerful is definitely a lot narrower than it was in 2014. I mean, having played with a lot of 5th edition monks, in a lot of ways the class is almost unplayable. Like the amount of times I'd have someone bring a monk to the table and combat would start, and if I targeted their monk, it basically meant they would drop to 0 instantly. That isn't good game design. I'm sorry. Like, I don't care how interesting you find the class. Not playing the game is not good game design. So, whereas like Wizard was so powerful that you could basically do anything. It was almost like having a modding kit for a video game, like just the amount of things you could do with it. So in a lot of ways, Wizard is still kind of like that, but just the other classes have been buffed enough that I think that, like you said, even like right now, I think Rogue is the one that's being speculated as the weakest class. And I can see lots of fun you could have using the Rogue toolkit. You may not be doing the most damage or anything, but you'll still be triggering meaningful narrative moments by playing it.
Moving on to chapter 4, which is the character origins. It's nice to have these backgrounds. I like how they've changed the backgrounds. One thing I thought would have been a little bit better is if they still said that you could customize the backgrounds explicitly. You can do it because they break it down for you, and they say, parts of the background include ability scores, feat, skill proficiencies, tool proficiencies, and equipment. And usually, each background offers a choice between a package of equipment and 50 gold pieces. And I think that you could just use that to create your character's background. But again, I think I liked it better when they said you can customize it like as part of the default rules.
Oh yeah, no, this is one of the most questionable decisions I think they made. And like I think I mentioned this in a podcast that there are hidden rules for customizing your background. So it's not even just looking at the template and then working off of it, but in character creation, there's a sidebar that says if you use an old background, just pick 3 ability scores to increase and select one of the origin feats to update it. And I mean, the way that would work is you'd select an old background, you'd customize an old background, and then you'd basically get free ability scores or an origin feat anyway. So it's not offensive in that it's so obvious how you create your own background. Like all the tools are there. It's just like for all the good things they did in having such good advice and having such explicit official permission to change various things about the game, to not have that be part of one of the things players loved most about Tasha's, which is moving ability scores around. It just felt it was a minor thing that felt so out of place. It's like a pebble in your shoe where you can't help but notice it because it's like the one thing that's like a little bit off. So I don't know about you, Ian, but I've already told my players, like, we're ignoring the background rules. The way we're going to do it is, start like pick 3 ability scores or increase 1 by 2, 1 by 1, pick 2 skill proficiencies, pick a tool, get some gold and an origin fee, and let's just play D&D.
Yeah, I'm actually going to have to go back into my setting guide and change the rule there that I had for backgrounds to match this description and just say, you can customize your background, and then just copy paste all of this. And it's the same thing with species. It tells you the parts of the species include its type, its size, speed, and special traits. The special traits being the most unique and revamped in 2024. I really like them.
So one thing I found really interesting, now that we've gotten through character origins, is how in this latest book, the options are presented in reverse chronological order and by mechanical priority. So one thing I'd always advised new DMs that taught new players to do is to actually have them pick in this order. Like, have them pick their class first, because that's going to be the thing that they're going to be interacting with most in the game. And is going to have probably a lot of the most story weight, especially in combat. Like, it could be that, like, I'm a dwarf and that means certain societal things like in the game's world or whatever. But really, when it comes to like combat and a lot of the big choices players are going to make, it's going to come from their class progression. So one of the things overall I really like about this book is there are certain lessons you can draw from, either as a DM teaching new players, or if you want to be a game designer yourself and create your own system or your own world or whatever. How you present the information matters.
Awesome. So chapter 5, you got your feats.
So first you have your origin feats, right? Which are explicitly meant to be picked up by first level characters. Not all of them are created equal. There are definitely some, like alert or musician, that are way stronger than, say, crafter or skilled or savage attacker. One of the things I was initially very skeptical about was how all of the general feats, which have a prerequisite of character level 4 or higher, are basically half feats, where instead of they each increase an ability score by 1, in addition to all of their other little features. I really liked in 2014 how you'd have to give up an ability score increase in order to get some sort of big power boost. But seeing how a lot of the effects got reworked, it's so much more likely that each character is going to be a little more interesting with just a tiny little twist that you wouldn't get in the 2014 version of not having half feats. So in a way, the half feats, it may have like a little bit of a power creep for the new edition. And I think ultimately it's going to make the gameplay a lot more interesting. So it's something that I've come around on. For the epic boon feats, they're finally epic. I think it's interesting, like, again, going back to Treant Monk and talking about his damage graphs, you can see with every build he's done that once you hit 19th level, and especially for marshals, they get an epic boon, there's a huge spike on the graph that just demonstrates how big of a difference they make. Another thing that's just really interesting to note is that if you build your character cleverly, and you line up so that at level 19 you get an ASI, and through another class at level 20 you get an ASI, you can get 2 epic boon feats, which has the potential to be very powerful. I'm curious to see what kind of builds people come up with. And they've done a really good job of making level 20 like feel really powerful as well. And so if you do this multi-classing thing, you'll also be giving up some of those capstone abilities that end up being like Monk, especially like getting a straight +4 to Dex and Wisdom. That's really significant. So it's going to be interesting to see whether or not this creates a big power imbalance, or if it does create an interesting decision, each with its own benefits and costs.
Yeah, and we will see, because I feel like with these changes, more and more people are gonna want to get to level 20 in their game. So they might even just like start at level 10 instead of starting at level 3, which is it's apparently the recommended, or at least it seems like it's more recommended to start at level 3 instead of level 1.
Yeah,
Which
they say flat out, it is
Yeah.
recommended if you have seasoned players to start at level 3.
Yeah, don't make them slog through the goblins again, man.
The one thing about not getting to level 20, I can speak from just personal preference. Uh, the higher you get in level, it just becomes a lot of a greater risk that some players just won't have fun. And what I mean by that is we're experiencing a little bit of it now in Geras, which is the home campaign I run. And it's something I'm being very open about, which is after level 12, the gaps potentially between an optimized build and a not optimized build just get wider and wider. So as much as I said earlier that the new class design, the power between the strongest and weakest class is narrower, we're not talking about multi-classing and optimization. So if say you have a player that knows how to optimize a wizard, and they're getting to like level 18, level 19, they've got ninth level spell slots, and you have another character that just builds like, I don't know, a 19th level champion, and they're not picking the best weapon masteries or the best feats, there's just such a greater risk that that champion fighter is going to have significantly less fun than the wizard. It's going to feel like the champion fighter is just sitting there watching the wizard bend the multiverse to their will while they're like, "Oh, can I hit with my sword again?" And for some players, they'll still find joy in the simplicity of the fighter mechanics. I just, again, from my experience, the higher in level you allow the players to get, the greater the risk is that the game is just going to get a lot less interesting because they're going to get a lot more powerful. I really do like, you've brought up Baldur's Gate 3. I find the sweet spot to honestly be like levels 3 to 12. Like once you hit level 12, that feels like you're a really powerful character. As a DM, it still feels like if you throw a CR 19, CR 20 monster, it'll still be a challenging encounter, but not something where you have to fear just completely TPKing accidentally.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely can agree on that, and it kind of reflects it in the modules that they put out. Almost none of the modules for 2014, I feel like, brought you up to level 20. I think level 20 is really for like those players who enjoy combat enough to where they want to see what happens when they have all of the things to work with. And whether that's for good or bad, they're there to have fun and enjoy the experience of it. And so I think it's the same thing here, right? Where it's just, you don't need to get to level 20 to have a lot of fun. But if you are the type of person who enjoys more and more micromanaging of features, then it's there for you.
Yeah, and from a story perspective, like there are plenty of stories where things get ridiculously over the top, and that's the enjoyment of them. A good example is Gurren Lagann, the anime. It's just the whole point is just how weird and wild things can get. So I think level 20 is like a fun option for people to visit every now and again. I just think that the reason that most games on average end around level 10 is that's when the game feels satisfying to conclude, not necessarily just because people fizzle because of scheduling conflicts. I think that's where DMs find the sweet spot where the game is complicated enough to be interesting, but not so the players aren't so powerful that you can't do anything with them. But that's my personal take. And I mean, if you're a listener and you play at level 20 frequently, please like feel free to disagree with me and let me know your experiences. I'm only just speaking from mine.
Going on to equipment. All right, chapter 6. That's where you get your mastery properties for your weapons and stuff. And it shows you the different masteries in that handy dandy table. One thing I noticed was that muskets and pistols were part of the martial ranged weapons in terms of the default lore, the default setting here. And I think that's fine. If you think about like knights and fantasy and stuff, gunpowder and guns, they were starting to ramp up then. So it kind of makes sense that you have a musket that like fires a single shot.
The one thing I will say is I understand why it was made core, and this is one of those things you want to talk to your DM about. Um, Personally, I'm not a big one with mixing my guns into a medieval magical fantasy setting. I think that there's definitely a time and place for it, and I would definitely respect. I've played in games actually where the GM allows players to build gunslinger characters and stuff. This tends to be one of those things where historically, yes, accurate that gunpowder existed and that these things were being developed. And again, just talk to your DM about it. Everyone has a different comfort level with just firearms as a concept, much less something introduced at your table. So just the more that you communicate it, the better the results are probably going to be.
And of course, we've talked a little bit about the weapon mastery properties and whether or not we think they're going to slow down combat.
For those who may be new to our podcasting, I play a lot of solo D&D, which just is I build a character or a few characters, and I usually just run them through a module, and I just open up a Word doc and I write it out like a short story. When it comes to the point where it makes sense to make a check or an attack roll, I just roll a dice and then just narrate the story in my little Google Doc as it goes. And I did create characters using these weapon masteries. Of course, it's different because at a live table, the time element is something you have to like account for other players. So just because I can be really fast resolving the weapon masteries doesn't mean that the group of players will resolve them quickly. And for the most part, the weapon masteries didn't provide any more slowdown than cantrips. Because remember, a lot of these are just cantrip effects. So like reducing a creature's speed by 10 is Ray of Frost. Pushing a creature 10 feet is Repelling Blast. I think that there's been a little bit of an over response of, oh my goodness, weapon masteries can slow down the game. The obvious one that stands out is Topple. That's the one everyone is super afraid of. And you have 5 weapons in the game total that have the Topple weapon mastery. You've got quarterstaffs, battle axes, lances, which if you're running lances in your game, I've never seen someone take a lance because we don't do horseback riding, but mauls and tridents. Those are the 5 weapons that have the topple property. Now, in the playtest, Fighter did have a feature that let you put the topple weapon mastery onto some weapons, but that was reworked into only switching out for push, sap, and slow. So, which tend to be quicker to resolve anyway. Again, the sap property is just vicious mockery. So, when you think of it in terms of, oh yeah, it's just a cantrip, but you might be hitting more than once. I really don't realistically see the slowdown being all that much worse. I think again, one of the things you also have to remember is if you're playing these against monsters from the 2014 Monster Manual, you're only playing with half the game. It is supposed to be played with the 2025 Monster Manual. So, yes, players may be learning them and getting used to them now, but we won't really see whether or not they're quote unquote overpowered until we see the new monster design. Overall, Ian, do you have any closing thoughts on the 2024 PHB?
I give it a good old thumbs up. I think that the book is well thought out, it's well organized, and the rule changes are very useful, comprehensible, and familiar, because it's not just about the new players. Obviously, we want to get more and more players to play this game, and we want to get more people to DM the game, which is really the problem. But that'll come with the DMG. And I just think that for all the things we were worried about, all the drama that happened, this was a really good outcome as far as like the actual product goes.
I think as most people's entry point into TTRPGs, the new rules are much stronger than 2014. I don't think that it's the ultimate TTRPG. I think there are still some things that can be smoothed out, which is why I'm still developing my own system that's based off of a lot of the framework of 2024. And I do want to give it credit for a lot of the things it does right. For the most part, I do like weapon mastery. I do like the new crafting rules. I don't think they're anything particularly revolutionary, and I still think there's some rough spots that can be sanded out. And I agree with you. It's a very strong product. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Dragon Mind is a proud member of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. To discover more TTRPG content like this, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com. If you had any insights or questions, be sure to email us at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com or post in our discussion channel in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord, linked in the description below. Our theme song, J-Pop, is brought to you by Thesleyan Studios. You can check out more of their awesome work at thesleyanstudios.com. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.
Well, Grimton, Morlinde and Ulrich are gone. We're in a new, unfamiliar land of Kolgafir. What's our first move?
Polaris, I'm not too certain, but I did hear Fishbelly talking about something.
Oh, yeah. With the warlord's half-sister in a meeting.
Yeah, that's about the only lead we have so far. We haven't been here long. Might be worth checking out.
Seems like a plan to me.
Join us as our party explores an unforgiving region of the Cusp and allies with new party members in Arc 3 of Advantage, a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons audio drama focused on storytelling and character development, in the Darkmoor Podcast Network. Find us in your podcast app.